I've been feeling a lot like, in a way that I have absolutely nothing to say. And maybe it's because I'm sort of exhausted. And because I think you're right, you make all these choices about being an artist. And I think many of the choices that I've made, my commitment to other artists, the way that I feel about other artists, the way that I feel that from my vantage point, it's absolutely necessary to champion other artists and to see myself in connection to other artists is endlessly important. It's endlessly fascinating. It keeps me up. It gets me up in the morning thinking about what other artists do. Gets me up in the morning. And it assists me in sleeping at night, really thinking about what other artists do and what my connection to those artists are. Sometimes I'm deeply jealous, so that forces me to get up, or kind of like an envy, or maybe it's a combination of many things. That it's a sort of jealousy, and it's a sort of envy, and it's sort of a compassion, and it's also a kind of understanding that if other artists are out there working, then surely I must be working too, right? I mean, that seems to me to be very, very important. And so I suppose that it's not just envy, and it's not just jealousy. It's certain, there's something about courage and about discipline, about getting up and getting it done. And that other artists are constantly showing me, and certainly the artists that I am interested in. And sometimes that interest is an interest that's born out of great admiration, and sometimes I'm absolutely very disturbed by what other artists do. That also gets me up in the morning. That the work that I am troubled by, that I have great problems with, like Kara Walker's latest piece is very disturbing to me. This gets me up in the morning, thinking about why this is a problem and what that work actually means in a greater sense. And so, I look at it, kind of like the wounds of this woman. The wounds of this woman, then what she's able then to lay bare for us. So that I like the work isn't even important, right? But what it means and what it speaks to about the life of an artist who is willing to tell you a very ugly and very painful truth about what is going on in her imagination is pretty extraordinary. And that sense that there's something about one's ability to negotiate the truth, sort of a painful truth, because usually truths are more or less painful, right? That is the thing I think that artists try to get to in the deepest possible way. And that it's difficult, and that it's hard, and that it's exhausting, and that it's painful, and that, yes, there's some joy and stuff in there someplace as well. But the greater sense, I think, is not really so much about that. I think it's really about trying to get to something that's deep, and something that's authentic, and something that's true. And so Kara gets me up in the morning. I wonder about her, and I worry about her, because she's been willing to lay her life and her body on the line for us. It's a pretty extraordinary thing to do. It's a pretty courageous thing to do. And there are, of course, many, many artists who function in very much the same way. most of us, I think, that are really serious about our practice are often functioning very much in that kind of way, where we are really trying to sort of get at something that's really deep about the who and what and the why of ourselves, and then how we make that relevant and important through the practice that we are engaged in. Of course, many of you have seen the Sigmar Polka exhibition, which is, I think he's an extraordinary artist. I'm not quite sure if I love the show, but I absolutely love the art. Love the man. It was very important. And so you know, right now what I'm doing, you know, like I just finished this for instance, this retrospective, and I thought that that it would be really the thing that would make it most interesting was not to simply have an exhibition of my own work, but rather to use this, to use it as an incredible platform for discussing lots of ideas and lots of other artists. So I decided, just as I was finishing up this, producing this exhibition here at the Guggenheim, that I should do a project. It was called Carrie Mae Weems Live at the Guggenheim. It was live streamed, which was very important to me. And it really came out of, again, sort of my fascination with interviewing other artists. I've done many, many interviews with artists over my long years now as an artist. And I actually started my career doing interviews with other artists, running around the country, raising money so that I could do more interviews with other artists, and traveling up and down the coast, the East Coast and into the South and out West. And I mean, it's a part of what I do. I really do love talking to artists about what it is they're thinking about and what it is that they make and they do. And so coming out of that, it seemed really important then that I would use the Guggenheim as a way of, in a space where very few people of color have actually been, women have actually been and shown. You know, I was the first African-American woman to be given a solo exhibition there, which retrospective there. I mean, it's absolutely sort of staggering in this day and age that this would be true, that we'd be talking about the first of any goddamn thing. I mean, it was just sort of amazing. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be the first, then I have to do something really fabulous. I have to do something really smoking. You know? And so I called together, you know, all of these artists that I wanted to work with, and 60 artists from Carrie James Marshall to Okui Gandara and Thelma Golden, curators, and Jason Moran, and VJ Iyer, and Jerry Allen, and, you know, composers and musicians and poets and dancers, and, you know, just rocked. 3 days, fabulous, amazing. You know, that's probably one of the most important things that I've done recently, is to pull together these 60 artists to have a conversation about the range of work that's being produced within a certain context contemporarily, having a really close look at that. And out of that, one of the things that was sort of wonderful that came from that was that the Guggenheim, doing this retrospective, decided that they might like to make this program, this live event, this live streaming event, a biennial. So that was important. That was important. Something kind of shifted. We'll see if it's real or not, but at least for the moment, there was a kind of shift in the imagination about what was possible to do in these spaces. And I think that it's a thing that is really important about what artists do, because artists think, of course, normally outside the box. I mean, that's the thing that's special about what it is that we do. Not only are we sort of, you know, engaged in the sort of deeper exploration of the who, what, why of ourselves and the context in which we historically find ourselves in, you know, but we're also often thinking outside the box, and the way in which we then work is very different than the way in which, you know, people work in corporate America. It's not who we are. It's not the way in which we think about stuff. And so I think that there's something really vital about artists participating very broadly in this, in these kinds of endeavors. That what we bring to the fore is ultimately very, very different. These are some of the views from this traveling exhibition that, that have been moving around the country. And of course, here are some images from the Carrie Mae Weems Live project. This is a list of many of the artists that, some who participated and some were artists that we wanted to participate. But one of the things I thought was really important was to have, no matter what, a kind of a name call, a roll call. And so we did these sort of wonderful calls with poets and musicians of the names of any number of artists who come from many, many different places and cultures. But that I thought would be important to call their name in that space. Not only do I sort of, work with artists in that kind of way, I've worked with artists through my organization, Social Studies. I showed you a little slide of that before. David Ross and I did a class around social studies at Syracuse University a few years ago. Out of that class came a number of interesting projects, including a fascinating project called the Urban Video Project that Syracuse University has now taken on really full time as a really important part of culture in the city. I do a small project with kids called the Institute of Sound and Style, which is up and running right now in Syracuse, introducing kids to the arts, and we pay them a minimum wage because it's important for kids to be paid, especially poor kids to be paid. Over the summer we give them minimum wage, can't do much more than that, but they also train, and so it's a training program. And then I work with people like Theaster Gates, who was also one of our partners at the Guggenheim, with his group called the Black Artist Retreat, a group of really fabulous young artists, curators, and so forth that are doing tremendous work around the country. And now, of course, I'm live next to Robin in Cooks Falls, really looking at a small project and thinking about the way in which I would like to now invite another group of young artists like yourselves to do residencies. So the way that I work around the arts, the way I work through the arts, as I said, it gets me up in the morning and it sends me to bed at night thinking about a number of different ways that I really want to connect with artists, be with composers. Craig Harris was one of the people who worked with me very closely at the Guggenheim, made a stupendous body of work, composed a great body of work to play in the galleries. Vijay Iyer, who also won the MacArthur just this year, along with me, also performed. We did a really remarkable tribute to the artist Terry Atkins, my dear and great friend, who just passed away. A number of musicians then came out to play and to pay homage to Terry that day as the first part of the Guggenheim Live project. Jason Moran, also an incredible artist and performer who works, and a pianist, composer who works often with other visual artists, was also a part of the Carrie Mae Weems Live project. So again, as I said, I'm just thinking about this dynamic relationship that I had with artists and what they mean to me. Rick Lowe, who runs Project Row House, for some of you who do know, some of you who don't know, but all of you should know about Project Row House. One of the first young people in the country, very early when he was 25, who bought up a series of dilapidated properties in Texas and decided to turn them into artist in residence and community housing. Fabulous project, the Project Row House. Have a look at that. Wonderful young poet. One of the things that I like about working with other artists is, again, sort of creating those kinds of platforms for other kinds of recognition, So some of the great things that came out of this project was that this young woman, for instance, beautiful young poet who I had seen in Paris earlier last year, beautiful, fabulous. And she walked out on stage and I thought, oh, fuck. She is one of the ones. Like every once in a while in your life, it's like falling in love, It's like, that's the one. She was one of the ones. And so she did this beautiful, beautiful performance, and wonderful people were in the audience. And just then this past week at Celebrate Brooklyn, she performed before 7,000 people. First time in her life, right? So there are all these other wonderful threads, you know, building the threads. You're like, how are you connected to the world in which you live? And how do you want to be connected to the world in which you live as an artist? You know, that yes, making the work is absolutely essential to me, right? And when I can't work, when I can't make my work, I am filled with anxiety. I'm a very, very difficult person when I can't make my work, you know, but it's equally important for me to see to what extent I might be able to widen the path and assist other artists in the construction of their work. How do I do that? And what is the context in which we do that in? You know, because none of us are going to get anything done by ourselves, right? Of course, there's something about your own laboring process, but even then, you're still dealing with other kinds of influences and ideas that you have to negotiate, right? Whether there are systems and institutions or individuals or the artist or a history of art, you are always pressed against what has already been done in the context in which you live, right? And the more you understand that and think about that, as difficult as it is, I think the better off we are, because then we see ourselves in context. And seeing ourselves in context assists in seeing ourselves, I think, in a more engaged and dynamic way. So finally, you know, I'll just end this section with Magdalena Campos, who is fabulous. And Magdalena is one of those artists who endlessly who never fails to reach out to me, right? Deeply invested in her relationship with other artists, but also deeply invested in herself. I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, you know, a woman does not do shit just because it's good for you, you know? And that's perfectly okay. So she decided that she wanted to participate with me in the Guggenheim, and she would do this sort of fabulous, fabulous ritual. And so she had this dress made, this beautiful dress design, referencing the Guggenheim itself as a piece of sculpture, and just showed out. You know, brought with her these amazing musicians from Cuba, and we pulled them together with some of my musicians, and the sound that they made in that space, I thought that I had ascended. I mean, it was really, really quite beautiful, quite profound, quite important. And she came in with this sort of referencing to Yamaya, to the waters, and, and to this sort of transitional moment that was taking place in this museum. She said, "Thank you to Carrie, thank you to Carrie, thank you to Carrie. She came to the Guggenheim, and she kicked the door down. She kicked the door." It was completely insane. Oh, wonderful. Where's the opposition? These pieces that I make. Where's the opposition? Who's the opposition? Early pieces from who, what, when, and where, and 22 million very tired and very angry people referencing the slaveocracy, but also thinking very much about the manifesto, about social change, where in the world where there are hotspots, thinking about constructivism, using those ideas very early in my work. And it came to me at a certain point that, constructivism was really, these sort of emblems. I was like looking at like semaphore one afternoon, like semaphore flag. I thought, that's where Lorenzo got these ideas from. This idea of a certain kind of internationalism based on an international flagging system that was already known, right? And reinterpolating that into something that we call constructivism. I mean, it was like absolutely beautiful, but they're all the same. They're all the same ideas, right? Going back to this idea about understanding where you are, where you come from, and the context in which you live. They lived on the sea, right? They functioned by the ocean, and they were thinking about how do you develop an international language? Well, an international language has already been developed in Semaphore. Kind of amazing, kind of interesting. I don't know if anybody has ever talked about this, but I think that it should be talked about. So anyway, I've done all these kinds of things. I've worked on things related to sculpture, which I really, really love. Nobody else loves them, but I love them. So they're in my house, in my basement, unfortunately. Things that I've done in Syracuse, New York. When David and I did this project around social studies in New York and did this fabulous class, we were lucky enough to have people like Peter Sellers come and visit us. Is he coming, really? I have some great photographs of the group of us. I'll have to send them to you from that time that he came to visit. Fabulous, extraordinary, gifted man. Love this man. So smart, would love to work with him. In the middle of, sort of doing this work with David, a young boy was killed in my neighborhood. And it was out of, this sort of gang violence in our neighborhood and sort of thinking about social practice and thinking about the way in which art can be related to social practice. I started doing a lot of stuff like lawn signs and billboards. It was really sort of fabulous. I mean, I've kind of worked on this like incessantly for months and months and months and months and months. And then out of this came my newest project, the Social Studies project with these young kids, or rather the Institute of Sound and Style, my sort of constant way of working with kids in a regular way to sort of deal with and negotiate these sort of questions around violence and around community and so forth. So this has been sort of like really important kind of work, and it's the work that I just do. It's just like I can't help myself. I don't even like kids that much. But I'm compelled. I'm just absolutely compelled. I care about kids. I think I love them, but I don't really like them that much. And so, we did a whole, I did, lots of little things, lawn signs and matchbook covers. It's called Project Activate. Just this whole way of getting tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of material into a community, just sort of like saturating it. And the thing that's so wonderful about doing some of this stuff and making some of these signs, I made the first ones like 3 years ago. They're still up. They're still up. People see them falling down and they go back and they put them up. They put them back in their windows, right? I was reading the newspaper the other day about a march that was taking place through the city, and the reporter talked about encountering this sign, one of my signs that I made 3 years ago, so that you know that it has some kind of import. And I know that you may have wanted to hear me talk more about other things, but I think that this is the stuff that I'm sort of most interested in at the moment. I'm going to go back one slide. So contrary to popular belief, the matchbook that's in the middle, I made thousands of matchbooks, and I gave them out to bodegas. And the bodegas passed them out when people bought cigarettes or they wanted a match to do whatever they needed a match for. So a friend of mine who works with young people took one of these, some of these matches, and he passed them out about 3 years ago again to some of the young men that he was working with. The crisis for young black men in America is pretty tragic. It's pretty deep. It's significant, which is why I can't ignore it and not talk about it. Like in Syracuse, 48% of the young men, particularly African American men, have already dropped out of school, and the unemployment rate is more like 75%. I mean, it's like tragic. It's like crazy kind of stuff. Anyway, my friend gives this kid, contrary to popular belief, your life does matter. Passes out these matchbooks to these kids and some other stuff. So 3 years later, he's having his meeting. He's calling together some of these kids, to talk to them about where they are, what they're doing, what they think about. He said, listen, next meeting, what I want you to do, I want you to bring back something to the meeting. I want you to bring some kind of object, something that has meaning for you. Just bring back one thing that has meaning for you. And 3 years later, this young boy comes back to him and he passes him my matchbook cover. Contrary to popular belief, your life does matter. And for me, I think that that's just really significant. Right? It's just significant. And that these small gestures, these small actions are cumulative, and that they mean something, that they take on a kind of power far beyond anything I could have imagined, in a way, that a young boy years later would come back and say that this helped me to save my life, that I could put this on my side table and look at it every day and say yes, while there's nothing else around me that says I matter. There's nothing else around you that affirms who you are. And I think that it's sort of out of, that work, that space, that I've made a lot of my work. Because there is very little around me that really affirms that I should be doing what I should be doing, that I should be where I am, right? So, whether it's something like the Kitchen Table series, which came about, I was probably just turning 30, so I made this about 30 years ago, which is interesting, right? I made this 30 years ago. And I was really kind of like in a hell place. And I was working every single day. I was teaching. And of course, for you young graduate students and students that are about to go off into the larger world and begin to teach and to make work, I had no idea what I was going to make my work around or about, right? And so, but I'm working every day. I mean, I get up and I go to my dark room because I'm a photographer. I get up and I go to my dark room every day. I'm very, very disciplined. I get up at like 5 and I am on it, right? I am at my desk by 5:30 every morning, right? Even when I've been like drunk the night before, usually I make it to my desk, So anyway, you're like I'm in hell. I cry every morning. I wake up and I cry. You know what I mean? But I get to my desk, and I work and I have my coffee and I cry. Then I get in my car and I drive to school and I cry all the way to school, and then I teach. I teach with my great students who I adored, and and then I finish up at the end of the day and I get back in my car and I cry all the way home. And I work some more, and then I cry myself. And this went on for just like months. I was absolutely exhausted. But it was, it was like I was just simply struggling to get at something. I was struggling to really get at something, and I was struggling to really locate the who and what of myself, and the nature and the sound of my own voice, and the importance of that voice to what it was that I needed to do. I mean, it was just sort of an incredible time. That sort of struggle to locate your own voice, the struggle to locate your own work, the struggle to know that this thing that I am making, all that money that my mother and father are spending to send my ass to SBA is actually worth something. Do you know what I mean? Right? That I'm actually doing something with it besides wasting their time and their money, right? So this thing about the discovery of voice was really important. And so in the middle of all of this sort of agony, and I'm listening to music because I love music. I mean, I cannot live a day without hearing great music. I'm listening to music, and I'm writing, and I'm stumbling, and I'm photographing, and I'm thinking, and and then one morning, my best friend called, and I answered the phone, in a voice that was so familiar, but so not the voice that had ever come to me, that I put down the phone and I walked around the room for a couple of minutes trying to figure out where it come from. I mean, like, did that actually come from me? The sound of this sort of authentic thing that was not what I thought I was supposed to sound like, but indeed what I did sound like. And the thing that was terrifying was that it sounded just like my mama. It sounded just like, oh my God. And yet it was mine. It was mine, and it was mine like in a really important kind of way. It was mine in this very, 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 very important kind of way. And that I think somehow it really had to do with somehow sort of stripping away all these kind of weird, this weird artifice, right? Because you think that you're supposed to respond to a lot of shit that just doesn't belong to you. It belongs to lots of expectations and assumptions about you. It doesn't belong to you. And so struggling to get to that sort of sound of authenticity that was actually my own, that came from something that was deeply, deeply, deeply familiar, was very important. And wow, the thing that was very interesting was that I stopped crying. I didn't cry for a very, very, very long time after that. And in the middle of all of that, I made this piece, which I still think is perhaps one of the most important pieces that I've made. And the discovery of a way of looking at the world, a very particular kind of point of view, this way of sort of examining and using all of these very simple tools to examine and to question. And of course, you know, I love text and language, and so it was also a way of getting at a certain kind of language. And the text was written like that. I actually sort of recorded it, you know, on a ride after visiting a friend. Actually, after seeing my boyfriend, you know, and it wasn't like a good trip, so it was even better, you know, because it really aided in something, you know. That so little happens out of happiness. A lot of shit comes through anxiety. So, but it was very important. So that's Kitchen Table. And working on this piece has been very important. And the thing that's also very interesting about this, I have to share this with you, as younger artists, this work, figuring out this work, really figuring out this work, really led me to many, many other bodies of work. That if you can locate voice, if you can locate your pattern, if you can locate the thing that really interests you, if you can locate your construction of the world, right, that it really sets you up for the long run, for the long haul, that it really helps you in negotiating the next body of work, and the next body of work, and the next body of work. And that you have to make it because you are true to that work, not because you're trying to, again, figure out assumptions about what you should be doing, whether it's, you know, Professor Ross or Professor Winter. You know, you have to make it out of your own, because at the end of the day, it's your ship, it ain't theirs. It's your ship, you know? Your own archive, in other words. What is your archive? What are your patterns? What's your system of thinking, of making, of doing? Coming out of working with Kitchen Table and working with other artists, seduced by one another, yet bound by certain social conventions. You framed me and I framed you, but we were both framed by modernism. And even though we knew better, we continued that time-honored tradition of the artist and his model. I wanted to deal with a few ideas, but it was working with Robert Colescott that sort of helped me sort of figure out yet another body of work. Standing on shaky ground, I posed myself for a critical study, but was no longer certain of the questions to be asked. It was clear I was not Manet's type. Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me. But it could have been worse. Imagine my fate had de Kooning gotten hold of me. And there are other parts to it as well. But think about that sort of building of your archive. I've also been really fascinated for a long time with ideas around architecture, and I've used architecture again and again and again in the work, often and for a very long time. Though often when writers are speaking about my work, they usually don't talk about my fascination with architecture, which is kind of unfortunate. I think that they really miss the point, you know. It's like when you start lumping everything around, you know, race, sex, class, then you really can't really talk more specifically about what a work is. These pieces I really, really love because I think, you know, about the sexuality of buildings often, and it's in certain kinds of places that, of course, it exists in the United States and in Europe as well, but in certain other places it's really spelled out much more specifically, you know, who belongs to a space and maybe even why. It's inscribed on the building itself. I absolutely love these buildings. But I've used this kind of work to move me through sort of looking at the sort of structures of architecture, how architecture informs what a place is for. At one point, the Getty was interested in my doing some work with them, and I made this piece called "From Here I Saw What Happened, and I Cried," another significant piece. And the thing that I love about these pieces is not only, you know, have they been interesting and important works, and they've brought up all kinds of issues around appropriation, and, you know, the story of this is a lecture in and of itself. But the work has also really sustained lives. It not only has it sustained my life, it's sustained the lives of my printers and my framers and, you know, the people that I work with actually to make the work possible. You know, the work is really, in some ways, in some sense, much bigger than I am, and that it really does take care of us. I'll read this piece to you. From here I saw what happened, and I cried. You became a scientific profile, a Negroid type, an anthropological debate, and a photographic subject. A really fabulous deselection of ideas. Descending the throne, you became foot soldier and cook. You became house, yard, fields, and kitchen. You became Uncle Tom, John, and Clemens, Jim. Drivers, writers, and men of letters. For your names, you took hope and humble. Black and tan, your whipped wind of change howled low, blowing itself smack in the middle of Ellington's orchestra. Billy heard it too and cried strange fruit, tears. But your resistance was found in the food that you placed on the master's table. Ha. Born with a veil, you became root worker, juju mama, voodoo queen, hoodoo doctor. Some said you were the spitting image of evil. You became playmate to the patriarch and its daughter. You became an accomplice. And the music for God Bless the Child. Out of deep rivers, mixed-matched mulattas, a variety of types, mind you, sprung up everywhere. You became the Joker's joke, and anything but what you were. Ha. Some laughed long and hard and loud. And others said, well, the only thing a nigga can do for me is shine my shoes. And restless after a longless winter, you marched and marched and marched. And in your sing-song prayer, you asked, well, did my Lord deliver Daniel? There are many stories that I can tell about this project, and ideas about appropriation, the problems that I ran into, all the institutions that thought that they were going to sue me, and then they didn't. Harvard was going to sue me, and then I said, okay, you should. Maybe it'd be great to have this fight in public. And then they decided not to, and then they said, okay, well, if you ever sell the work, you have to give us 20%. And I said, well, okay. And then they bought the work, and I didn't know what to do. Pieces on fabric and cloth. I've made lots of different kinds of pieces. This one was for around the Hampton Project. It gives a sense of scale and the way in which they operate in rooms. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to show these at the Guggenheim. We didn't have enough space. But a really wonderful project nonetheless, another important project. And for some reason, I'm always having fights with people. I don't always understand it. But Hampton decided not to take the show because I named the Native Americans who were buried there. And so they decided not to shake the exhibition. And I thought that that was a problem. So, works from Cuba, working with Cuban workers. You know, I come from a farming family. I did a lot of farming when I was a young girl. And I stopped farming when I was about 15, and somebody introduced me to a teacher, came along, and he said, Miss Weems, you know, there's a summer program I'd love to introduce Carrie to. Can she, you know, be relieved from her chores for the rest of the summer? And so he saved me, pulled me out of myself and introduced me in the fields and introduced me to the theater. So getting back to the fields and thinking about them, it's been something that I've done a lot. But Cuba was an important place, and I think at a certain point I realized that I was really deeply engaged with aspects also of performance. And the work told me that. It wasn't something that I really sought to do, like with Kitchen Table. I just did it because I was there. And I knew what, you know, if I wanted to work at 3 in the morning, that I could work at 3 in the morning. I really didn't do it because I was interested really in looking at me so much. But it helped. And then at a certain point, I realized that really I was very much interested in the acts of performance and the performative act, and that I could move myself around the world along with my little fucked up camera and make whatever pictures I wanted to make of myself. And I've been doing that for a very long time in many, many, many different incarnations and ways. Things from the Louisiana Project, another commission that was an important piece. I started with a group of silhouettes, but also did, these are 5 by 7 feet, but also did a series of black and white portraits as well, based on these ideas of carnival in New Orleans from a very early period of time. Some of the early carnivals were really based on Darwin's The Origins of the Missing Links, and was coming about also at the same time that African Americans were moving into independence as well. So it was really sort of a fascinating place to work. New Orleans, of course, is really not the United States. It really is another part of the country. We just say that it's in America, but it's really a part of Haiti, or it's a part of something. It's its own nation state, really. And, but working with it, looking at it, dealing with, again, architecture as a sort of a site and a symbol has been absolutely important. And, you know, I often, you know, just sort of take over places. And so I just walked into this place and started dancing. Working with David Ross, again, in Beacon, New York. And again, sort of finding this motif, finding this way of working that I knew that I don't really like photographing people very much. I don't like when people photograph me, really. So since I felt that way, I felt that I really needed to figure out another way of working. The Cuba material comes out of that. The Kitchen Table series comes out of that. The New Orleans series comes out of that. Rome comes out of that. All of these pieces really come out of that. But these early pieces with David in Beacon, New York were some of the first. With David and in Cuba were some of the first times that I began to use this woman in this very particular kind of way to confront, again, architecture and other artists, looking at Saul LeWitt, for instance. I love this picture. It's a really beautiful, beautiful, beautiful photograph. Around that area, of course, were a number of prisons, and so we needed to look at the prison industrial complex that existed around Beacon and the way in which Beacon was changing as a territory, as a place. You know, and so for 3 years, I had a little place. It was called the Record Shop on the main street, where people would actually come and leave their record. And the record was, how is Beacon changing? And the hope was, of course, was that every 3 years there would be another artist who would come and leave their record, and then that record would all go into the Historical Society. It would be a way of marking the history of a city and its transformation with a number of artists. It was a brilliant idea. I think it was a really wonderful idea that we didn't get around to fulfilling. I did my part, though. Did my part. It was wonderful. Beacon's an interesting place, and I'm sure that many of you now have gone to Beacon and don't know a lot of what that history really was and what that city was when David and the Beacon Foundation actually moved there in 2001. 2002. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here. I'm going to just show you a few more photographs, and I'll talk a little less. When I was a young girl, I really wanted to go to Rome. But I knew that if I went to Rome, you know, like I had seen Gidget, yeah? Gidget goes to Rome, but maybe many of you are like, you know, so it's like, you know, like the ideal way of like, you know, going to a city, 16, beautiful, young, and I thought that, you know, I would just have sex with lots of very cute, you know, Italian boys. So I went to many, many, many places, but I actually never made it to Rome. I didn't make it to Rome until I was much older. I was like, you know, in my 50s. I'd been to all these other places, and finally I get to Rome. And I was really glad, because I realized that I probably would have just sort of slept away the summer as opposed to actually getting work done. So by the time I actually got to Rome, I really had a sense of what I wanted to do and how I really wanted to engage, again, with the architecture of the space, the meaning of the architecture, and the relationship of the architecture to the role of the state, to the role of the state. That, you know, that it's in Rome, really, that the first state is developed. It's in Rome that money and bartering, really, you know, is developed. And I thought, I have to really deal with this city. It was fabulous. It was really wonderful. I had a great, great time. I did like the American Academy in Rome for a year. It was truly one of the highlights of my life. And I got up very, very early, and I walked the city. I knew the city like the back of my hand by the time I was through with it. It was very, very interesting on a number of different levels. This is San Lorenzo, the neighborhood of San Lorenzo, the only part of Rome that was actually bombed during the war, but also the most militant part of the city. Very, very interesting history. And again, I sort of marshaled myself through it. I really wanted to look at that part of Mussolini's Rome and fascist Rome, you know, a Rome that we really don't sort of think very much about contemporarily in terms of architecture, but it's a very powerful and important part of the city. Of course, Pasolini and the important Italian directors have all looked at these sites in the URA, the Euro area of the city, and it's a very important area of the city. This is, of course, the Jewish ghetto, very important part of the city, also a magical part of the city for me. And just as I was finishing up Rome, I started photographing museums, again sort of letting this figure sort of guide me through, this sort of muse, guide me into a very complicated world of sort of looking and considering the role of architecture, the role of the power in the state, the role of museums. And so then I thought, just as I was finishing, because I'm really sort of work obsessed, that I really needed to just travel as much of Europe as I possibly could and just stand in front of those museums, stand in front of those spaces. Just stand there, just be a witness, this moment, this time, to what these spaces are, to what they have historically represented. It was very important to me, and I continue to do them. I just go stand in front of museums. And some of them are really quite, I think, wonderful. I use an old Rolly, an old fucked up camera. But I can't help it. I have all this expensive stuff, but I just love my Rolly. I know exactly what it does. And I really hate over-information. I think that we're like in a period of over-information right now. You know, thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures that you take that you'll never look at. You don't even know what they're doing on your camera. You know, on your computer. There's no way to process them. There's no way to see them. It's just sort of, you know, I think that people should like limit themselves to like making like 20 pictures like a month. Do you know what I mean? And just getting rid of all that other stuff. You know, I was like at the Museum of Modern Art the other day, yesterday. I was looking at like some images of their garden. And, you know, they had this poor woman. She spent like a year gathering like thousands of photographs of their garden. We sit there, we go through all these pictures yesterday. And I realized that after about an hour, you know, that we still only had one photograph that made any sense. There's only one. I mean, you know, like hundreds of pictures later, there was only one that made a certain kind of sense. There was a beautiful thing that was completely realized. And so, you know, I mean, I think that there's something really important about limitation. You know, about structuring your limitation. Building limitation around your making, of giving up. You have to give up. You have to churn up. You have to do that, right? You know, absolutely. I'm not saying not working very hard, but working very thoughtfully. You know, and not being such a slave to sort of the way in which this material, all this stuff forces us to react to it in a way that I think is damaging to the system. You know, I mean, I turn on my email, I just get sick. So, you know, anyway, these institutions that I continue to look at, I love them. I think they're really important buildings. You know, for the most part, of course, most people of color are not in them. You know, a lot of women are not in them. You know, so I find it imperative to stand in front of them. And just to mark that thing, And so, I think I'll just show you just a few more images, and then like this series called Equivalents. These are all based on images made by other artists that I've recently made over the last year. It's an ongoing series as well. It's sort of things that I would think about putting into those museums. So it's sort of fun, sort of thinking about it from that vantage point. You know, like I love Magritte, I love, you know, Picasso, all these people, but you know, they certainly have no, you know, like it's unrequited. It's an unrequited love. And the thing that's sort of interesting about kind of getting to this point where you realize that you're living, that that you're always like on the edge of center. There's great promise being on the edge of center. I mean, there's sort of a wonderful way to play with all kinds of material. As serious as it is, there's a great way of playing with lots of material that nobody would assume that you would play with. So there's there's something really wonderful and kind of subversive there, because nobody would assume that you would know enough to even bother about playing with the material or with the ideas. And so there's something actually kind of wonderful about living on the edge, as much as I am disturbed by it. You know, so it's sort of a paradox. I was completely in love with Fellini. I would get up like very, very early in the morning and watch Fellini's movies and think about him and just sort of pine over the sort of beauty of what he had made, you know? Even when he was evil and a bastard and an asshole, I really did love him. And then, he sort of, really made me think that, well, my responsibility ultimately is into constructing the reality that I want to see. That's my responsibility. It's not his responsibility to include me in his worldview. It's my responsibility to include me in my worldview and to figure out sort of strategies for pushing those ideas into, if not the mainstream, into position to be seen and questioned and provoked. So thank you.
We have time for maybe a couple of questions, if you like. If anybody has any responses or questions. And but yeah, wait for the microphone because it'll be a recording.
Thank you for sharing, just being so open with all of your feelings. I was so curious to know what you were feeling in the moment when you were standing in front of all those different museums, because you're clearly very passionate, and you spoke to us sharing about your pain and struggle and joys in seeing art and beauty, and also the joy of seeing the struggle. So there's a very consciousness about what you're doing, the thoughtfulness in each of the photographs that you're in, and I felt really wanting to know what you were feeling in your heart was peace or confrontation or all of these things at the same time.
Sometimes it was I hope my bag is safe.
Well, I was wondering about that too. Yeah.
It varies. It's not really consistent. Really, sometimes it really is. It's just. That you have a deeper sense of what I have a sense of what I'm doing there and what it is that I'm trying to do there, and so sometimes it's really lame. It's and then sometimes it really is very much about the building and about sort of questioning the building, but and sometimes I'm just thinking about the position of my body in relationship to the picture plane. And just being very conscious of my movement. So at that point, I think it really is much more about just the process, just doing it, because it's very, very physical. And only once have I taken somebody else with me when I was in London because it was so difficult to manage. I needed somebody to help me get around the city and to really watch my bags and things while I ran to and fro. But normally, it's a very demanding kind of way of working. But I think I really like it because it's a thing that's really physical about the digital age, right? When there's a printer that's making my stuff and a framer that's building the frame. For me, it becomes very important to be physically engaged, and it's the way that I actually engage that.
When you talked earlier about having all these feelings about other artists' work and how that motivates you, does that ever change when you actually get to know some of these artists? Is there a difference between admiring work from afar?
Absolutely. Right, the idea of the artist and the artists themselves, absolutely. I met Nina Simone once. Do you know who Nina Simone is? So, so it was this fabulous day in Paris, unbelievable. It was if I had died and gone to heaven, it would have been all right. So miraculously, it was just sort of one of those incredible days. I met Toni Morrison earlier that day, who had just been, who just received it had just been announced that she had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Had just been announced, hours before, and suddenly I'm sitting with Toni Morrison and Barbara Chase Rabu and sort of wonderful people, and so we toast with Toni, and I stumble out of this place, and just as I stumble out, I'm in Paris, right? Somebody drives along, and they say, "Carrie Mae, what are you doing in my neighborhood?" And I said, what? And I said, well, coming with you. And he said, great, because I'm going to see Nina Simone. So I thought, well, fabulous. So I jumped in the car. Off we go. And we're on the way to see Nina Simone. And Nina Simone, who I have loved since I was maybe 15 years old, is just probably one of the more complicated women on the planet. Very tough. Had felt so abused and so used by so many people that who she had become as a woman was really quite unpleasant. She was not a pleasant human being. And so I was very disappointed. But I still really love her music. And so when I listen to her, I really try to disconnect. I try to separate, that she is not, she is all of that and more. She is all of that and more,
Questions?
You mentioned that thinking about other artists and art gets you up in the morning, but you also have the thoughts, like I relate as an artist, having doubts, getting excited, being envious, or being admired. How do you quiet that down so you can sleep at night?
Well, that's the unfortunate part.
No, you're just still in sleep.
Not well. I suppose I'm a little obsessive. I think I am. I wish I am. And so I work all the time. And I think my husband always says, well, it's the price you pay for the life you choose. I think he got that from The Godfather or something.
I thought you mentioned sleep in there, so I was just hopeful.
But at the same time, I really, I have this feeling, so I don't feel like playing right now. I really have this feeling that I just don't have wah. And I've had this feeling for a very long time. So for me, very seriously, every moment is very precious. And my work is probably the most important thing that I'm engaged in. And so I don't really play a lot. I don't really go out a lot. I don't party a lot. I really work most of the time, but it's the thing that I really love doing. I'm trying to really, I'm trying to figure out if I can get to some other kinds of truths that I need to know about in my life. And I don't know if it will translate well into another kind of work or be useful to me in any kind of way, other than really trying to sort of look at it and negotiate these sort of feelings and these senses that I have about what I need to do with this life, and that it doesn't last long. And, and I only have a minute. So make it very, very useful. Just make it useful. And so that's just the sort of pressure that I am under. It's the pressure that I somehow or another I've put myself under, or that my brain has me under. But I accept it in some strange way. I just accept the fact, the thing that I'm working on really right now, we didn't get to it in my slide presentation. There are two things. One is that I'm absolutely obsessed around notions of representation and what that means. I have been for a long time. How to make this work now, this narrative change, how to sort of switch it, so that I can actually talk about some sort of complicated ideas that I can ask people to listen to engage with me around. Because often, so how to make this work. These ideas about modernism, I think, are really important. And that for the most part, around sort of both the sort of collision of representation and modernism is even sort of more important to me. So how to really talk about that is the thing that I am completely obsessed with, and I'm trying to work out right now. And I'm also, working on a piece about aging women. It's called Swinging into 60, as I sort of approach this new sort of point in my life. And so anyway, I'm having like a kind of a great time. It's difficult, but I'm having a great time. And I think that I've sort of figured out a few things. And the thing that's also interesting to me that I must say, and I don't know how anybody else sort of deals with this, but even though I don't sleep a lot, I'm in bed a lot, you know? And one of the reasons that I'm in bed is because I really love, there's a moment when you're completely relaxed. For me, there's a moment when I'm completely relaxed that my body receives information. It receives information. The work tells me what it needs. It tells me usually what it needs, not when I'm actually working on it. It tells me what I need when I'm laying down and I have a sense of myself, that I'm literally buried in my bed with my notepad usually very, very close by, and I'm just laying there relaxing, and invariably these pulses start to happen, and the visualization of material makes itself really evident. And there's something really important then about sensing the self, you know, just sensing what this organism is, what it does, and what it wants to do, how it imagines. And I think then giving yourself sort of the leisure to do that, I think is really important. Some people do it in bed. Some people do it in other ways. Lots of women actually do it in bed. A lot of women I know who are artists spend an enormous amount of time in bed with the blankets over their heads, but yet making like incredible stuff, you know? And I think that there's something about this biology that matters and that we can use and that we should pay attention to.
I'm glad
So,
I
okay.
got-
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question or comment. Mark?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm ambivalent about asking this question, and if you don't feel like addressing it, that's cool, but questions of race, exclusion, and inclusion in the museum are very present right now in public discourse in connection with both, well, Kara Walker's piece that you mentioned at the Domino Sugar Factory, but also Joe Scanlon's project that was exhibited at the Whitney Biennial, Donnell Wolford. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to comment on this debate that's been going on, and particularly on the Donnell Wolford project, the YAMS response, et
I'm
cetera.
sorry, I can't quite hear what you're saying.
Yes.
Joe Scanlon's piece at the Whitney Biennial. How do you say, yeah, in Africa in response to that?
But that's not exactly, that's not the only question.
If you
The
might offer a
broader
comment on it.
issue of representation, issues of.
Yeah, maybe I was holding the mic in front of my face and you couldn't hear. Yeah, I'm just, so race is very much in the discourse right now, vis-a-vis both the Kara Walker project, the Domino Sugar Factory, and also Joe Scanlon's Donnell Wolford project that was exhibited in the Whitney Biennial and the YAMS response. And I'm wondering if you could offer a comment. I think the issues are really complex and very, and the questions that they raise are present in a way that they perhaps haven't been since the mid-90s when Thelma Golden curated the Black Male show and the Whitney Biennial that preceded it.
Well, I do think that it is complex, and I think that it sort of begs more than the few minutes that I have here for sort of deeper conversation, because I don't think that they're really simple projects. You know, I think we started out, I don't know if you were in the room when I spoke about Kara's piece.
Yes.
You know, Joe's piece, I think, is sort of more fascinating. Now, I don't know him personally. When I, of course, saw it and read about the work, and when I've read his response to the work, I think it's sort of, in some ways, his response has been actually more upsetting than the work itself. His inability to respond, and his sense that he actually doesn't have to respond, that he has no responsibility to anybody in responding about this work. And so I find it sort of I find that more problematic. But I think that these sort of complicated questions that he's raising are really, I mean, I think that there's a ground, that there's a source for complicated play that is absolutely imperative. And that in part, that I have a sense that in part, that's where Joe has situated himself. But that's only my sense that that's where he's situated himself. I don't really know because he hasn't said so. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm.
And so yeah, for me it still is complex, and I can't sort of answer with sort of like in an ironclad way, you know? But I think that it sort of begs all of these kinds of questions about, you know, first of all, you know, the larger question for me is, I'm going to move beyond him. The larger question for me is, who has a right to make a work about anything? I mean, the question of right, the question of who has a right, the principles of right, actually, is really the sort of deeper question.
Ethical question.
It's an ethical question. The sense is that a white man has no, contemporarily, has no authority to use and reference the black body in this way.
It becomes minstrel.
Right? Right.
Al Jolson.
Right. Well, but again, beyond Joe's work, the deeper question is, what do we have a right to investigate as humans? My sense is that I have the right to investigate all areas of life.
So when you use the Gary Winogrand picture in that great series of the couple,
Yes.
The black and white couple
Yes.
carrying the chimp,
Yes.
which was controversial then,
Yes.
and is controversial now in the retrospect.
Exactly.
It remains a controversial picture because what are we amused by? What are we taken in by in that Winogrand photo? You know, when you look at that picture again today, when you were back in the modern era,
Right.
so you know, what do you think today? Did he have the right to take that picture?
Of course he has. Of
Of
course he has the right to take the picture, and of course I have a right to critique the picture. He has a right to make it, and I have a right to critique it.
So it's about a site for the contest of values.
I think always. I think that this Joe Scanlon thing is really very interesting, because I think that there's a problem in the sort of sense that, so somebody calls me up and they say, listen, we want you to come and do a talk, and we were thinking that it would be really great, for instance, if LaToya Frazier interviewed you. I said, really? Well, why LaToya Frazier? Right? We want you to come and do a talk, and we thought it would be great if Thelma Golden interviewed you. Well, that's great, I love Thelma, but why Thelma? We'd like you to come and do a talk, but we would like Okoye to interview you. Never David Ross to interview me, never Robin Winter to interview me, people that are as interested in the work as anybody else. There's a sort of assumption that the sort of, right, that this is the easiest path, right, is that another black artist will be interested in you, as opposed to having, so I said, well, listen, why don't we do this? Why don't you have LaToya interview Jeff Koons, right, and have Aggie Gunn interview me? Right? I mean, let's sort of switch the, so I think that, there's something I think about these sort of ways in which you're drawing these boxes around ethnicities and these sort of, groups, like, why would I be interested in you? This kind of bullshit we got to get past that, So I'm interested in Joe Scanlon's work. I think that it's problematic, but I'm certainly interested in it, and I think that it's really important for us to begin to sort of unpack the ways in which we can work in dynamic ways around these questions of ethnicity, of race, and gender, to sort of take it to another place, right? And that as long as we assume that this sphere only belongs to me, that I am the sort of arbiter and the bearer, sort of, of racialized America, I think that that's a problem. And surely white people know more about racism than I will ever know.
You think that's what Thelma meant when she invented the term post-black? in that exhibition.
That's, I think that she was trying to get at
A
that.
certain kind of
She was trying to get at that, exactly.
Kind of exhaustion.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that this idea around the notions of, contemporarily people call it narrative change is a part of that. How do we still have these sort of complicated discussions around race and ideas because they matter, and yet at the same time know that we are also dealing with other issues that are equally as important. What is my relationship to modernism as a modern woman, as a modern artist, as a producer? What is that relationship about? I think it's really fascinating. And to the extent that we are excluded from the modernist debate is to the extent that we are ultimately marginalized. So I'm off to a conference, for instance, tomorrow. I can't believe that I'm doing this, but I'm going anyway. It's around questions sort of like the Black aesthetics. And the problem with this is that there's this sort of idea, once again, that there's this sort of box that these people will be placed over here, and this language then will follow it in order to...
Well, the trap of essentialism in general.
Right, exactly.
I think we need